So he's our Family Scholars Program, which Professor Nteta is a part of. And it's where scholars from across campus come together and work for a year on their research and grant proposals among scholars from all different disciplines, all addressing in some broad way issues facing families. And as part of that scholars program, we have an endowment to bring in speakers from across the nation and across the world, actually, experts in areas of family, which is how we get to have the speaker series today. And that is funded through an endowment of the Ty Gavin Erickson Endowment through Dorothy Gavin, who's been our funder and starter of the center. So I just want to say a special thank you to you for letting this happen every year. Thank you very much. So before I begin introducing our scholar for today, and he gets to introduce Dr. Stoker, I just want to tell you about a few things that are happening for the rest of the semester. The main event that's happening is on April 17th, the Rudd Adoption Conference, which is co-sponsored through the Rudd Adoption Program and through the Center for Research on Families. And the theme this year is launching into adulthood. And these conferences are day-long with speakers from all across the country that come in and talk around issues of foster care and adoption, and it's really an outstanding. It's right on this campus, so if you're interested, there's posters here and there's information on our website. So our speaker today is Dr. Laura Stoker, who comes to us from Berkeley, and she was invited by our Family Research Scholar, Professor Tatish Nteta, who I'm going to introduce, and then he's going to introduce Dr. Stoker. So Tatish received his BA in African American Studies in Government and Politics from the University of Maryland, College Park, and then went on to get his Ph.D. from the University of California at Berkeley in political science. And very broadly, his research focuses on the intersection of politics, of race, of ethnicity, and public opinion and public behavior. And in our year in the Scholars Program, we've spent a lot of time talking about what sways public opinion, what sways our legislators' views and attitudes. And interestingly, a big piece of that you'll be hearing about is family, and specifically fathers and daughters, and how that changes opinion. So we've had some really fascinating discussions in our Scholars Program. His research specifically focuses on contradictory theories about the role of fathers and daughters in families and political ideology. One set of scholars has found that daughters lead fathers to actually support more conservative views, Republican from the Republican perspective. Others have found that men with daughters exhibit more liberal attitudes on a range of issues, indicating support for sort of more democratic ideology. And so as a served scholar, Tatish has been developing a grant proposal, which now is actually slightly different than the title I have here, which often happens in our Scholars Program, The Political Effects of Children, Public Opinion, Political Behavior, and the Transformative Impact of Fatherhood. And so with no further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Nteta, who will introduce Dr. Stoker.
So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Laura Stoker. She received her Ph.D. from the University of Michigan in 1990 and is an associate professor at the University of California at Berkeley. She's among the leading scholars of political socialization with a focus on the impact of life cycle events on public opinion and political behavior. Her work has been published in the Journal of Politics, American Political Science Review, Political Behavior, American Journal of Political Science, and a number of other venues. And she's been a valued mentor to generations of both undergraduate and graduate students, including myself. So please join me in welcoming Professor Stoker, whose talk is entitled Family and the Reproduction of Political Inequality. So thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I grew up in Minnesota, so I'm used to the weather. I was born on the East Coast, and so I have an affinity for that. And I've never been to Amherst, or at the University of Massachusetts, so it's wonderful to be here. So to begin, what draws me to the study of political socialization is that while the first order focus is on questions about individual political development, how do people's political orientations and behaviors develop first in childhood and then continue to develop and change over the life cycle, those individual level questions are almost always married to important questions about the macro polity, about how society changes, the polity changes, how group divisions emerge. That macro focus is what draws me to the field and is really what I'm focusing on in my talk today. At the individual level, the question is on how a person's predisposition to be involved in politics is shaped by the experiences they have growing up, and particularly shaped by what their parents do when they are growing up. At the macro level, the question is, what is creating and sustaining political inequality? And by political inequality, I mean something like the picture I'll show you here. This is just turnout rates. On the y-axis, the percent reporting voting. This comes from the current population survey from 1964 to 2012 as a function of an individual's level of education. And what you see there is comparing those four groups in terms of their educational attainment is dramatic differences in rates of voting participation, at least as large toward the end of the period, if not larger than the earlier period, a persistent pattern of what political scientists call political inequality, by which we mean some systematic non-political characteristic is orienting political involvement levels. It doesn't, in this case, it's educational attainment, or in general, some sort of marker of socioeconomic status. Political inequality could also be studied, and is studied from other dimensions: gender inequality, racial inequality, and so on. My focus is on participation differences by education, or more generally by socioeconomic status. So what the pattern reminds us is that we have this very, very dramatic difference in voice. People at the lower ranks are much less likely to be involved with the higher ranks. Well, this shows it only for voting. If I were to use other data to show for any other form of political participation, campaign contributions, get involvement in elections, community involvement, something similar would be shown. It's not only vast differences, but it's persistent. It's been with us since the beginning of our measurement of these things through survey research. Now, it used to be that we thought we understood why this was there. And the primary way we understood it was that the acquisition of higher education had a causal effect on your likely to participate. And there were different arguments about why that happened, but sort of the general idea is that as you acquire higher education, at least two things happen. You change your citizenship orientations, you become more committed, in particular, to the idea of yourself as an active, involved person. So sort of a psychological change. And you also became more politically literate, or able to bear the costs, both in terms of the intellectual costs and the time costs of getting involved in politics. You simply understood politics more. You were able to take the time to go vote, and so on and so forth. So it was all about the civic skills and resources and the psychological predispositions that led education to lead to higher levels of participation. Now, recently that has come into question. And in fact, I am one of those who believes quite strongly that education does not, in fact, have a causal impact on your likelihood of voting. That there's this strong correlation there, but it's not because the acquisition of higher education has those consequences that we used to think were true. Now, there's a whole different variety of studies that have called into doubt the causal question, but my first step today is to provide some of my own evidence on that question as to why this is not rooted in the actual acquisition of higher ed. To do that, I'll say a little bit about the data I'm working with today throughout the talk, and it comes from a study called the Political Socialization Study, often, that was initiated by a former graduate student mentor of mine, Kent Jennings, back in 1965. When he interviewed a national sample of high school seniors, all 18 years of age in 1965, along with one or both of their parents. One parent for the vast majority of cases, for a random quarter of the sample, two parents, and were then almost universally two-parent households. That was in 1965. In 1973, they were re-interviewed again. The younger generation, which I'll refer to sometimes as the class of 65, they were now 26 years of age. In 1982, they were re-interviewed for the third time. The former high school seniors were now 35. And in 1997, they were interviewed for a fourth time, and I came on as a PI in the project at that point, and they're 50 years of age. So we've been following the same people from 1965 to 1990. Now, for the first three of those waves, 65, 73, and 82, their parents were also interviewed. One of their parents was interviewed. And in 1997, we also gathered data on the children of the former high school seniors, the third generation. So what I'll be eventually reporting today is data on parents and their kids from both the original pairing, the high school seniors and their parents, and then later on, those high school seniors in the role of parents and their children, the second and third generations. To start here, I'm going to show you, however, some findings about participation over the life cycle that are indicative of why I'm skeptical that education has a causal effect. On the y-axis, I have an index of participation. The measure varies a little bit across the waves, but in particular, it varies between 65 and 73. After 73, and here's following that high school senior class over time, it's an index of actually what people did politically. The minimum is 0 and the maximum is 1. In 1965, it's a measure obtained from interviews with the kids when they were high school seniors about their anticipated participation rates as adults. And then the three different charts distinguish people by their eventual educational attainment. In 1965, everybody was a senior in high school. There was no difference in their educational attainment. By 1973, these divisions had emerged. And what you see is that there are systematic differences in their actual or propensity to participate already well in place before those educational attainments emerged in 1973. There are lots of different ways to run this analysis, but we find always the same thing, that those actual participation rate differences that emerge after the educational differences emerge were already in place when the kids were exactly the same grade in high school, exactly the same level of educational attainment. From some different data sources, another piece of evidence that is the one of many other pieces of evidence I could provide to you to suggest that we have a correlation between education and participation that isn't causal. This comes from the article shown down below, and it reports anticipated education, and that's the different groups. College aspirations, no college, 2-year or 4-year college aspirations, by anticipated or intention with respect to voting. And what you see is that there are, well back when these kids are all the same age, again, this is when they're in high school, their anticipated educational attainment is very, very strongly correlated with their actual anticipated political involvement. So once again, well before any real educational differences have emerged, we also see this pattern suggesting that there are massive differences. In fact, this chart looks an awful lot like this chart with actual differences. So, where does this come from? And my answer is it's going to be at least in part rooted in what political experiences these different groups have when they're growing up. That there's a radically different political socialization that these group experiences that is responsible for their eventual differences in political participation. Now, to start off with, here's sort of a quick survey of some of the differences in the familial environment in 1965 by our high school seniors for that cohort by their own eventual educational attainment. So this is indicating how did the political environment, how did the parents differ between those who eventually attained a college degree many years later, or at least some years later, versus those who did not go on to attain more education. And what you see on all these indicators is that those who did not go on to achieve more higher ed were already very different from those who did go on to achieve higher ed in terms of their parents' attention to politics, interest in politics, knowledge of politics, sense of political competence or efficacy, their tendency to be involved in civic organizations, non-political, usually community organizations, like the PTA, and their rates of political participation. So this is just a first glimpse of how radically different the political socialization environment of those groups were. Those going on to achieve higher ed were already being socialized in a very different way than those who didn't. And here is where I sort of take a step in a slightly more unusual direction. And the step is one that takes a more, still quantitative, but sort of qualitatively inspired look at the socialization experiences of these different groups. And this is to say, to think about the pre-adult years and what the family provides to the socialization experiences of those who go on to be my high school seniors and so on. To think about what plays out over time, in particular within those families, and what plays out with respect to both parents in those families, rather than just taking a snapshot like this. I'm inspired here from both from what's called social learning theory, and that comes from psychology, and from the research of a family studies scholar, Jacqueline Eccles. The social learning theory holds that the most important things that parents provide is to be found in their behavior, what they actually do. And in particular, that children are very influenced by the patterns of behavior of their parents that are consistent over time and consistent across parents. So I'm going to be looking at the question of how the socialization of individuals is shaped by parents' political participation rates that are either episodic, inconsistent, or consistent. I'll be looking at offspring participation as a function of whether one or both parents behave in a consistent fashion, with the idea that children are much more likely to emulate their parents if they're sent this kind of consistent signal. That's the social learning perspective, and it's an argument that speaks nothing about the macro level question, but it speaks about only to the micro level question of how are predispositions to participate inculcated. The other inspiration for this is work by Jacqueline Eccles that looks at a totally different matter. It's the development of tendencies toward leadership as a function of experiences in mostly elementary and secondary schools, but to some extent in high schools. Also working with social learning theory, but arguing that it's the consistency of role models that are showing leadership properties in traits that ends up creating children who go on to be leaders. That it's not enough to take a course in leadership or to have one leadership experience, but it has to be woven deeply throughout a variety of experiences over time and across different role models. So that's the same sort of inspiration I take to thinking about what could be different in the socialization experiences of those who go on to participate at higher role rates. So because of the data I work with, I have to separate out these sort of two types of consistency. One is consistency over time, and one is consistency across role models. In the context of thinking about parents as role models, the first question is, are parents that are consistently involved while the child is growing up more likely to create this active, involved offspring than those who are episodically or inconsistently involved? And similarly, those who are consistently uninvolved, much more likely to produce that person who never does a darn thing in politics. That's the first question. The second question, again, from the same sort of perspective, is what about in two-parent households? Does it matter if they're both involved or both uninvolved, as opposed to this mixed pattern? According to social learning theory and the Eccles research, these things should matter a lot. I address it quantitatively, but as you can see, it's a kind of qualitatively inspired question. So I'm going to, because of the time, I'm going to skip over the technical details. And that's really great for me. And so I will just want you to believe that I have nailed it, and then you can attack me in Q&A if there's time. If not, you can attack me in the hall. All right? So the first thing I'll say is I've taken and looked and divided the parents into ones that are consistently uninvolved, consistently involved while the child is growing up, and in the middle, episodically involved. And I've done that for the two sets of parents, for the first and second generation, and for the second and third. And here's just some regression results that I'll let you stare at for a moment, and I'll point to a few things, and then I'll give you the picture, which is much easier to see. So, the big picture of this, the thing I want to kind of highlight is that I'm looking at parents' impact on their kids, comparing that first and second generation, where I can follow the kids' participation as they went through their teens to 20s, 20s to 30s, and 30s to age 50. Whereas in the second and third generation comparison, the kids of the first pairing become the parents. And now I'm looking at the kids who are actually kids born in the late, in the 70s and 80s, sort of Gen Xers. All right? So I have these both things, and then I can look at whether the parents' participation is more consequential if the parents are consistent as opposed to inconsistent. And if you just look at a lot of coefficients and don't know what it means and see those stars, you see a very consistent pattern. And the picture tells the story, and there's the picture. This is the picture just for the first and second generations. The y-axis is the offspring participation level. That's the participation level when they were going through their teens to early 20s. From 1973 to 1982, they aged from 26 to 35. And in this period, they aged from 35 to 50. And this is just three groups: those whose parents were consistently inactive when the child was growing up, the parents that were consistently active when the child was growing up, and those whose parents were sometimes active, sometimes not, in and out of politics. And this is based on non-voting participation. I have another analysis on voting that mostly will get set aside today, but shows the same kind of pattern. So this is stuff like, this is an index of whether they wrote a letter to the editor, did something to solve a community problem, joined a club, put a bumper sticker on their car, a whole variety of different things. How active were they? And again, could range from 0 to 1. So what do we see here? Now, thinking immediately just about the individual level, what we see is that those whose parents were consistently inactive start out inactive and don't change very much. All right? Whereas, and they come into politics not very active and they stay that way. Whereas if they came from homes where the parents were always involved, they start out very active and they stay very active. If anything, they're more active during this, of course, very, very, very turbulent period than any other period. But they're certainly not growing over time. It's only these people who have a sort of inconsistent signal, sometimes the parents are doing something, sometimes not, who show this pattern of growth of the life cycle as they age from their teens to age 50. Now, from a political socialization standpoint, this is an arresting figure, because the actual rule of the standard conventional wisdom about how political involvement changes over the life cycle is this guy. You start out low, then you move into your middle ages, you settle down, you have children, you start getting very involved, and there's this upward trajectory that is considered the standard life cycle trajectory. And so a first point this makes, thinking about the political development, is that that's just a very misleading portrait. It depends, crucially, on the quality and quantity of socialization you experience growing up. And sometimes you just sort of never go anywhere, and sometimes you start out hot and stay that way. And it's only when your socialization is pretty mixed signals that your development is fundamentally shaped. What about two parents? Here's another set of findings. Now I'm working with mother-father triads, mother-father-child triads. This is a simpler one. There's no regressions. There's just a bunch of means here. In one case, both parents, you could say, were fairly inactive. In another case, both parents were fairly active. And the other, there's a mixed picture again. And this is just the average score for those first, of the children in that pairing. And that's the average participation score of the younger, the kids, in the second case. Now, there's a lot to stare at here, but the crucial point is that those whose parents were inactive look an awful lot like those whose parents, who had one parent involved. And the only kids who really distinguish themselves in terms of their activism are those that had the two role models, both of them out there getting very, very involved. So we can look at this and say a couple things. I like to say, put it this way, that if you are a parent, this is a causal interpretation, and you can nail this for not nailing the causal interpretation, but giving that interpretation nevertheless, one parent getting involved doesn't produce that engaged citizen. It requires those two role models. Having one parent involved, that mixed signal does not much more than having no parent involved. Another way to think about this is activism is hard to socialize. It has these very strict requirements or rigid requirements. It requires continual participation, as we saw earlier, and two parents involved for the child to emulate that and follow that. So that's the individual level story. Going beyond the sort of standard story to bring in these social learning ideas. And now let's tie that back to the inequality question. To do so, it's all about these kinds of findings. What is the relationship between these very crucial circumstances and education and class or educational attainment? Here, the head of household, the parent, education. Think in those cases where the parents have very little education or have a college degree, what's the quality of the socialization they're providing to their kids? Well, consistent inactivity is the norm down here and declines dramatically as you move up the education continuum. And this crucial pattern of consistent activism, it's not there. It's gone at the bottom of the continuum, and it's much, much more common among those who have a college education. So if you put this together with the previous argument, the point would be these kids who come from these homes where their parents have little education are exposed to a qualitatively different kind of socialization experience. Most of them are going to have grown up with parents who don't do anything. At best, one parent who's involved. This very powerful pattern of parents who are consistently active, that's the preserve of the upper class. Right? They are the ones that have the privileged socialization that produce activism. Ditto, if you look at the kinds of homes in which this other ingredient of two active parents is found. It's not found among those at the bottom of the continuum. That is found again at the people at the upper. I can show you these same pictures with your own education as opposed to your parents. People who go on to get a college degree versus those who don't. Again, this is working with that class of 65. Their parents were radically different in terms of their likelihood of being consistently inactive, or more importantly, that consistent activism. And similarly, looking at your own level of education, those that don't go on to further ed were much less likely to have two parents active in the household. And this is among people who have two parents. These people are also less likely to have two-parent households, all right? But among those who do, they are not both involved. Whereas if you go on to acquire a college degree, what happened when you were growing up is you were just much more likely, 4 times more likely, to have two parents who were involved. At the crucial period of time, I should mention, this is the sort of the adolescence, the period of adolescence. All right. So the story is the reason, at least partially the reason, that we have this persistent gap in political participation by education, is that people who go on to acquire a higher ed, and those who don't, have radically different political experiences growing up. Their parents' political socialization is what leads them to eventually go on to have different rates of political participation. The answer is to be found in the experiences they have growing up. They go on to they come from homes where their parents tend to be inactive, either one or both, and if active at all, inconsistently so, those at the bottom of the spectrum. At the top of the spectrum, you're much more likely to find those powerful socialization contexts where the parents consistently active and both parents are involved. So it's the deficit in the socialization experience that is responsible for creating this and keeping it being reproduced over generations. Because the offspring then go on, at the bottom of the end, to be episodic or not involved. Their offspring go on to be episodically or not involved, and so on and so forth. And this process is reproduced as a function of family reproduction. That's the potential. So it's a pretty depressing story, actually. And so the next, I have two more moves before this talk closes down. The first move is to ask, and if you thought the results here so far were kind of hand-wavy, guess what comes next. Even more hand-wavy, but nevertheless, to me it's the ideas that I'm just drawn to. So the first move is to say, how can we break that pattern? How can we break that pattern? How can we take those households that these kids grow up in and make them different? Or how do we change the socialization experience of those kids who come from these low SES households where their parents are not at all involved or hardly involved? How can we change that? And if we were to change that, would it get rid of that inequality at the macro level? So the first thought exercise is, I know, let's target those low education parents and let's get them consistently involved, right? We could think of programs that we could implement that targeted those at the lower end of the class ladder to try to change the socialization they provide to their children, to get them consistently involved when those kids are growing up, not just once, but always, when the kids are 7, 8, 9, 10. Let's think about that. That's the first. I'll show you some results on that counterfactual. Second counterfactual is, well, let's do something a little bit more modest. Let's get both parents involved in the adolescent period. Let's just get both parents involved if there are two parents in the adolescence period. That's the second counterfactual. And the third counterfactual is forget parents. Parents aren't everything in the pre-adult period. The family is tremendously important, but it's not everything. Let's work on extra-familial influences. Let's think about how we can break that education-participation correlation, that political inequality, by introducing other influences on those peers at the bottom of the class ladder, particularly by politicizing the schools that those kids attend. Let's think about peer influence entering in. Now, to address these, the way to address these properly is to have some sort of strong research design where you can actually assess what happens if you get low education parents consistently involved with their kids growing up. Or what happens if you have some sort of intervention that gets both parents involved when that would not otherwise be the case, or what have you. I can't do any of that. All I can do is leverage the socialization study to look at what is to address these counterfactuals. And the next two charts do that. And they will be confusing to you at first, so hopefully I can make them less confusing. So, follow along, perhaps. There's our, these are the people, this is the offspring participation level again, at these different waves of time. And these are the ones who come from households that have, where their parents have less than a high school education. This is one end of the continuum. That was a very large fraction in these data, about a third. Because these are kids who grew up, who were in high school in 1965, right? And that educational attainment was very common for them to have their parents to have less than high school. This is the pattern that is sort of modal for that group. Their parents tend to be stably inactive, all right? And so this is this consistency of that. This is that pattern that we could sort of imagine trying to create through experimental intervention. Let's create stable activism among those people instead. So the counterfactuals, what if we could turn all these people into those people? Would we eradicate the education gap? Now the education gap is the blue lines relative to the reddish lines, all right? And so imagine I'm going to erase all these people and turn them all into these people. Do we have any resulting political inequality, the question is? And the answer is, darn it, yes. All right? Even if I were to erase all these people and create these people, those who come from higher SES backgrounds are still involved more. All right? You're not eradicating that gap. So even though this is sort of, this would be a gigantic task, try to create all these people, just the mode, and this is the rare exception, turn them into that, it wouldn't do the work, at least according to this analysis. Don't go there. What about if I could take and change the consistency of parent involvement? Once again, we have the voting situation where for those where the parents have less than a high school degree and none of them are involved. And I want to erase those people and turn them into both parents involved through my hypothetical intervention. What happens? Whoosh! Right? In my data, they participate at higher rates than anybody else. In fact, this would not only eradicate the education gap, it would reverse it. Now, I think this is fascinating as a fact about my data. What it's really telling us is those in the socialization study, those parents who came from very, very low educated backgrounds and were nevertheless, both of those parents were involved in the 60s and 70s, produced offspring who were more involved ever after. More so than those who had the same political profile but less education. I think this is fascinating, but these are very unusual people. These are the civil rights activists. Those are the activists of the 60s. That's an unusual group. Those are black people, poor people, people who were white people moving down to the South, fighting during the civil rights movement and in the anti-Vietnam War movement. Their kids are, in fact, today's activists. This is part of the reason we see that black people are participating at higher rates than you would expect, given their socioeconomic status, is because they grew up with parents who's like this. All right, so it's interesting, but do I believe that if we went to every low-income household and got both parents involved, that we could eradicate the education gap? This probably is not going to happen.
What percent of your sample was in that, like?
Tiny.
Tiny?
Think you remember, that's the small, 10% of that smaller group. Yeah, that was a couple charts back. It was like 10%. So, I mean, it was still enough people to analyze. It was like 50 people, but yeah. So then, peer politicization. So again, I haven't talked about this yet, but this is the result for those whose parents had less than a high school degree and whose peers, I've got independent data on their peers, and I won't go into the details. We got mass administered data on all of the high school kids at the high schools where our class of 65 came from. So these are apolitical peers in the mid-60s, based on independent questionnaires from those peers. And what you see is that if you have that disadvantage, your participation rates are very low. But what happens if you had the sort of disadvantage of growing up in that typical low-income education household, but your peers were very political? Then we move up to this blue line and notice that we've almost completely eradicated the education participation correlation. These kids who come from low SES backgrounds look an awful lot like the kids who come from high SES backgrounds. We've broken the correlation between education and political participation. The way I think about it, we've gotten rid of inequality. So to me, the most exciting thing is saying families have trouble providing the socialization to activism. They come from the bottom end of the socioeconomic ladder, but peers are tremendously influential. Fascinating for this particular study, the correlation between parent SES, education income, and the politicization of the peers is 0. That was unusual. I think nowadays would be more likely the case that kids from higher kids whose parents are at higher SES will go to schools where the peers are more politicized. But it's quite easy to break that correlation. In other words, it's quite easy to expose these kids from low education households to politicized peers. You have to work through the schools. You have to focus your politicization efforts, not turning them to left or right or Democrat or Republican or pro something or anti something, but getting them involved. You have to target the schools where kids who don't have the educational attainment or their parents don't have the education. That can break it. That's at least what this is suggesting. So if you want to eradicate inequality, political inequality, or you want to diminish it, the answer is compensate for the socialization deficit that comes from the household, from the family, by thinking about socialization through peer networks, again in the crucial pre-adult period. So that was the first, sort of less depressing message. Hey, we can maybe do something, despite the fact that this seems with us forever, this inequality. The second less depressing message is that if parents could only do one thing, if parents can't, if you want to inculcate activism in your child, and it's tremendously difficult to always be involved, to get both parents always involved. After all, there's an awful lot of demand, especially among those on the bottom end of the SES continuum. Is there something a parent can do to have a consequence? Is there like one little thing? And the answer is yes. And particularly anything that the child does, anything that the parent does during the critical pre-adult years is more important than ever. So that's the first sort of answer. I won't show you evidence on that general point, but if there's a life stage, this won't be surprising to you, but if there's a life stage where what you do matters to your child, it's the adolescent years. It's the adolescent years. Not the earlier years and not the later years, and that's the more interesting thing. It's too late to get your kid to vote when they're actually eligible. You have to socialize your child back when they aren't eligible, back when they're in the home. That's at least the way. So here's a way I'm going to show you the last couple charts to talk about it. What we did is look, because we have these incredible panel data spanning lots of time, we can look at, and particularly for the second and third generational pairings, but we do it for both, we can look at whether the parent voted when the child was 7 or 11 or 15 or 18 or 21 or 25. We can look at the parent's behavior as a predictor of the child's behavior at different points in the child's life. And the big finding, and this holds up for both generations, and I'm going to show you a couple charts for just the second and third generations. The big finding is that the parent voting when the child is in high school but not eligible, that moment is the moment where your behavior has the greatest consequence for the child. So it doesn't matter whether you vote when the child's actually eligible, it's 4 years earlier. That really is consequential. And to socialization, from a socialization research point of view, I love this, because one of my arguments, and all of our arguments about socialization, is often that the adult political being is shaped by stuff that happened decades before often. And here's a point of saying, look, it's what the parent does when the child was a child that matters. So here's a way of looking at it. This is for the second and third generation, because it's the easiest one to see. This is just using different predictor variables. This is just correlations thinking, sort of. When the child was in this range, this range, this range. This range, which is contemporaneous when the parent votes in the first election the child is actually eligible to, or later on. Think of these as, can I predict the child's turnout by the parent's behavior when the child was this age, this age, this age, this age, this age? And what always shows up is that the parent's behavior when the child was not yet eligible to vote in those crucial pre-adult years is the crucial variable. This analysis is a similar one, only this is a kind of even a crazier analysis. It's allowing several different parent variables to compete. The crucial adolescent period with any other period. Here's when the child was an adolescent. I've got 2 independent variables, parent turnout at another point in time. And if you can imagine how correlated parent turnout, it has to be a pretty big battle for this one to always win out, and it always wins out. It's what the parent did when the child was a pre-adult that matters. This again is showing for second and third generation. The same thing is held through a similar analysis the first and second. So the optimistic point here is, and then this is only dependent variables turnout, the child's propensity to vote. So, and this is propensity to vote in the first election in which they're eligible. So the moral of this seems to be that if you vote when the kid's an adolescent, your child is more likely to vote subsequently. And so I want to end with asking the question, wow, does that then eradicate the turnout inequality by class? And the answer is, yes, sort of, and no, darn it. And the answer is really this, that in that first election in which the child can vote, There's absolutely, it's gone. Inequality by class is gone. However, it resurrects itself. And this is the final slide. It's hard to see these charts again, but remember, this is the people we're going to replace with these people. These are people who didn't vote in that first election, that parents who didn't vote in the crucial election, and this is ones who did. And notice that the entire class gap is gone. In fact, there's absolutely no difference by education among the non-voters, whose parents didn't vote, and there's no difference by education among those who did vote. Right? There's no correlation between class and turnout whatsoever. We've eradicated it. But what happens as the child ages is it reasserts itself. No matter what your parent did, vote or not, you're never going to vote at as high a rate as if you came from a higher class background. There's those upper class kids, those lower class kids. That one reversal disappears. So what you can do is turn your child into a voter for the first election, even if you come, but it doesn't mean that inequality itself is forever erased. It's temporarily erased, at least with these data. So that really takes me back to the back. It's all in the pre-adult years. I think there's probably much more that we don't know that goes on, much more that could be said. None of my story ties in interest, efficacy, all the psychological variables. It's focusing on the sort of behavioral role modeling, but I think that the reason we have education, participation correlations, the reason why we have that inequality that is persistent is familial reproduction, at least in part. Thank you. Now, I'll take your questions, even the technical ones. Yes?
So does your data on the individual level and the household level help to explain that drop in voter turnout from 1964 to 2010? If people's education tends to run in families, and if voting behavior tends to run in families, then why as a nation do we not vote now the way we did in 1964?
So that is a question. So why is the turnout declining over time? And can we speak to that? I have not done a systematic analysis with our data. I think that actually consecutive cross sections do a better job of analyzing that. Jan Lilly and Bill Nagler? No. Well, anyway, Nagler and Lilly have a new book on that topic, arguing that does something like that. And then there have been other sort of studies as well. A first point to make is that, and political scientists like to make this point, is that the drop is exaggerated to what we often see because of the change in the racial composition and the immigration composition of the electorate. There's such a giant compositional change in the electorate from 1965 in particular to 2000, where we have this massive immigration. We have many, many more in the denominator of the people who are eligible to vote, who are first generation native or naturalized citizens, first generation, second generation, and the voting rates are going to fall just because of the compositional shift. So that's part of the story. It really has nothing to do with anything else. I believe that another point political scientists like to make is that if anything, the early 60s were the aberration. So we want to explain why that was so high rather than why everything else was so low. And that was really tied to probably a lot of it is tied to the extremely, especially in 1960, which was the record turnout, was tied to the incredibly high intensity election involving the first Catholic running for president. Catholic turnout was really, really high and Catholics were a giant fraction of the population. Now, what I will say, however, is that my argument bears on the question of why Generation 3, why these Gen Xers and millennials are less involved than their parent generation. Something I've written about in other contexts as well. And here I'd like to call upon a very famous sociologist, I believe, Robert Uthno, who has a book on changing participation over time. And I'd also like to refer to Theda Skocpol's book, Diminished Democracy. Both of these books, in different ways, argue about the sort of loss of organizational life and mobilization at the local level that used to sustained participation, that used to help parents stay politically involved over and over and over and over time. And that Luthno in particular talks about, and so diminished democracy is about how we've lost all these federated organizations, and that people, even when they join organizations, are in and out, and in and out, and in and out. They don't have these lifelong memberships in the League of Women Voters and all of that. They're just gone. Luthno says the same thing in different ways. He's focusing on more on sort of civic organizations, where Scotchpole is thinking about political ones, but people are episodically involved, in and out, much more these days. And to me, that's a crucial part of the story. And we don't have those big, long social movements that lasted a long period of time, that took those boomers and created that very unusual level of involvement. We also have, I think it's also generational shifting in terms of the World War II generation. Suzanne Mantler has a wonderful book on the importance of Title IX, not Title IX, the GI Bill. I was talking about Title IX until, there you are! The GI Bill, and about how the veterans organizations and so on all sustained a certain civic orientation. So I think it's generational change, but I think the socialization of, if we had the sweep of time to really understand socialization environment more, I think we'd see more episodic participation on the part of the parents now than parents 30 years ago.
When you started, I needed a definition of your word active. Were you really counting only those who vote?
No. So in my most,
Politically active
Yeah.
is used right from the very beginning, and yet you didn't define it.
I should
And
have.
I was, and as I went on, I thought maybe you were just measuring the voting.
No, so all of these were, when I use my terms loosely, but all of these kind of charts and so on, people down here do nothing. People down here do nothing. And this is, all of this is non-voting participation. So at the bottom is people who don't do anything. This doesn't, voting is set aside for this. I have a whole separate analysis of voting. And people have climbed here if they do any number of other things. So the people at the top are the people who give money, wear campaign buttons, who try to influence people's votes, who go to rallies, who protest, who write letters to the editor. And to score high, you've got to demonstrate a variety of different kinds of activities. So I think of this really as a tendency toward activism or involvement. Yes?
So you indexed participation and activity here, but are there any specific participatory activities which are connected more strongly with consistency?
No.
So
That is such a hard question to answer. I can tell you the following, and part of it is that no other activity outside of voting gets a lot of people. Closest thing is being involved in community problems, but those are so diverse themselves. So it's hard to take a look at that, but if you were to look at parents voting as a consistency of their voting as a predictor of their voting, there's no question that it's act specific. In other words, if the parent consistently protests, that doesn't predict the child's voting so much. It's if the parent consistently votes that predicts the child's voting. That's why in my analyses I use voting as predicting consistency of parents voting to predict voting, but I also have a tendency, an index of the parents' general participation. So even if you put an index as an independent variable, if you put the parents' level of participation in all sorts of non-voting activities in, it doesn't predict the offspring participation nearly as well as the parent actually voting. And that's what social learning theory would suggest, that it's act specific. If your parent writes a letter to the editor, you write a letter to the editor. If your parent protests, you protest. And so we can see that in the case of voting. But otherwise, it's very hard to see it because I don't have enough cases of parents writing letters to the editor and so on, but I can get glimmers of that. I don't, was that on target? Okay, yes, and then yes, and then yes, and then yes.
So social learning theory has also shown mothers and daughters and fathers and sons have stronger effects than, cross or whatever. So I'm wondering if you've looked at gender effects.
Not in this analysis, and I, when I have the triples, I can do that, mother, father, child, triples, and in other work I have done that. But in this case, you really don't have enough, what can I say? I think the process is too complicated, it varies by act, and we just don't have this sort of enough cases. And in general, we find less of that. The main findings in political science on this topic are as follows, that one, when the fathers and mothers are in disagreement on political issues, mothers win, hands down. Mothers influence their daughters more, and mothers influence their sons more. And that's a consistent finding across both of our generational pairs and lots of other data. And it's because, well, this is always fun to talk about because women have lower political expertise. They don't have as much knowledge or interest in politics and so on. Everyone expects the fathers to be more influential, but they're not, and that's largely because of social learning processes. Kids spend time with their mothers and not with their fathers. That's our interpretation. Secondly, though, where that differs, where there are these gender differences is on gender-related issues. And my colleague and co-PI and the mentor and so on, Ken Jennings, has a paper on that. It's probably coming out soon, showing that only on these gender issues do mothers have more influence on their daughters and fathers have more influence on their sons. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you looked at union membership as a variable.
And other work. One of the great things about this socialization study, and we haven't exploited it, if you do unions, it's such a great thing. We've got good overtime data. In other work, I've looked at consistency of class identification, and because we have the ability to look at people who float around saying, working class, middle class, working class, and we can look at people who say, I'm working class, I'm working class, I'm working class, and if they continue to maintain that identity over time, they're completely different politically than if their class is floating around. But there's no question that union members participate at higher rates than non-union members, holding everything constant. This study is amazing in terms of the occupational information and union membership information over time and generation. It really has a lot more can be done with it.
So I'm gathering that for the participation level index, it's based on self-report of these parents.
Yep.
And I'm wondering if the voting data is also based on self-report or if it's been validated.
No, it's not been validated. It's full of bugs. And it's full of bugs, and it exaggerates almost certainly the education gap. Because people who are more likely to over-report voting are the highly educated. So you can count on that being smaller than it actually is, and every gap that I showed you to be smaller than it reported, because we know that to be the case. But none of this is validated. But that's a good point. And I keep taking questions forever, but I know you're going to wrap up.
Yeah.
Okay.
I actually had also concerns about on that last slide.
Going to be
The
exaggerated.
turnouts were,
No,
tremendous.
crazy.
But
crazy.
the other question is you're finding really all of them, but especially the one that eradicated the gap with political peers.
Yeah.
Do
one of the most hand-wavy of them.
Well, yeah, and so are you able to, I'm not a particular fan of the resource-based explanations, but are you able to rule out that those people went on to become more successful and therefore participated more?
These politicized peers?
Yeah, the people who look like they're...
I can include, oh, you mean no.
The people who look like they're transcending their
There's so
backgrounds.
huge selection problems. So these people who came from, all I can say, this is the one, sorry, I keep pointing at my screen, which doesn't. So I can just say this, there is absolutely no correlation between this variable, politicization of your peers, and parent SES. So that's the one reason I believe this, is that there is no evidence, at least in our data, that people who have these politicized peers were substantially different in virtually any background characteristic, which is not the case for those other two charts. This one, the previous two charts, there are all sorts of background differences here, but this group and this group, aside from SES, they're different. They're comparable in virtually. These two groups are comparable in virtually everything. Yeah, so that's why I believe in the politicization of the peer results, because that I have better balance, as it were.
Mhm.
And now my final question Yes?
I had about 12 questions, but geographically, where are they, did you say already?
They're from 95 schools across the country, so they're all over the place.
Okay.
And many of them are still in their original location. So when I was a graduate student, I interviewed some of them in the Central Tennessee area. When I did the 97 study, I flew all over to find these people. We had a national field staff, but they were all over. One of our people in 97 was in jail. Several people were in, we found them.
So are you starting another longitudinal study with a different cohort?
No, but they might be. And a group in Europe that I'm working with might be. Yeah, I mean, I should, but I'm too old, so I'm living into the younger generation. I'm too tired. I mean, just imagine Ken Jennings, just a pitch for him. Here he is, just a babe in the woods, an assistant professor, and taking a chance on a study that he then carried for 32 years, and its significance grew and grew and grew, and to have that vision, it's hard. What we should do is go back to this cohort, get the fifth wave. We haven't done that yet, but the data are out there, and they're amazing for all sorts of questions, not just political sciencey questions. And they're also very hard to work with because there's so many different triples and. I even have 3-wave panel data for those who are interested in marriage. I have 3-wave panel data on husbands and wives over 32 years of their marriage. So, yeah, it's pretty amazing. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
I get excited.
I asked because we've been coming to school as the graduate and a lot of bounces back.
I don't think so.
That's fine. It might have been yesterday. It was just.
There's no trash can. Well, I'll give her a trash can. I don't have one in the room.